It all started on a rainy Tuesday. The kind of day when the clouds hang low and the air feels thick with more than just humidity. I had just settled into my office for another long night shift when I noticed a patient chart that hadn't been there moments before. Frowning, I picked it up. The name on the file read John Doe, and the room number was 302. My frown deepened. Room 302 had been empty for months, awaiting renovations. Assuming it was a clerical error, I set out to find the nurse who might have misplaced it. But as I questioned my staff, a sense of unease began to creep over me. No one had seen the chart. No one had placed it on my desk. And there was certainly no patient named John Doe in our system. Puzzled, I returned to my office, only to find the chart gone. I might have dismissed the whole thing as a strange mix-up, had it not happened again the next night. And the night after that. Each time, the chart would appear on my desk, always for John Doe, always for room 302, and always vanishing when I turned my back. As the days passed, I found myself growing increasingly on edge. I'd catch myself staring at my office door, half expecting to see someone slip in to place the mysterious chart. The rational part of my mind struggled to make sense of it, while a smaller, more primitive part whispered of things beyond understanding. It wasn't just the charts. Strange things began happening around room 302. Nurses reported hearing the beep of heart monitors from the empty room. One night, I could have sworn I saw a flicker of movement through the window as I passed by. But every time I checked, the room was empty, untouched, with a fine layer of dust on every surface. As October wore on, the occurrences became more frequent and harder to ignore. The phantom charts now appeared daily, sometimes multiple times a shift. They were always identical: John Doe, room 302, with a list of medications that made no sense for a non-existent patient. I began to notice a pattern. The charts would appear most often around 3 a.m., what nurses often call the witching hour in hospitals. It's when the night is at its darkest, and the barrier between life and death seems thinnest. More than once, I caught myself glancing at the clock as it approached 3, my heart racing with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The events around room 302 escalated as well. Equipment would turn on by itself, for stands would move slightly between checks, and the temperature in that section of the hallway would drop dramatically for no apparent reason. My staff started to talk. At first, it was just whispers and nervous glances. But soon, nurses were requesting transfers to other floors, and even some of our more stalwart doctors seemed to hurry past room 302. I tried to maintain a facade of calm rationality, but inside, I was struggling. My medical training and logical mind grappled with what I was experiencing. There had to be an explanation. Faulty wiring, pranksters, or maybe I was simply overworked and imagining things. But deep down, a part of me knew. Something was happening at Central Hospital, something that defied rational explanation. And somehow, I was at the center of it all. As I sat in my office late one night, staring at yet another mysteriously appearing chart, I made a decision. I needed to get to the bottom of this, no matter where it led me. Little did I know, I was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything I believed about life, death, and the shadows that lie between. The night that changed everything came after a particularly grueling double shift. The hospital had been bustling with activity, a multi-car pileup keeping the ER in constant motion. By 2 a.m., exhaustion tugged at my eyelids, but I forced myself to make one last round. The fluorescent lights flickered as I walked down the quiet corridor towards room 302. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and I could swear the temperature dropped with each step. As I approached the room, a movement caught my eye. At the far end of the hallway, a gurney slowly rolled into view. My heart leapt into my throat as I saw a figure lying on it, pale and still. But what truly froze me in place was the face. It was the same one I'd been seeing in fleeting glimpses and half-formed shadows for weeks. John Doe. His eyes, sunken and dark, fixed on me with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. The gurney moved on its own, gliding silently towards the elevator. I stood paralyzed, my mind reeling, unable to process what I was seeing. As if in a trance, I found myself moving towards the gurney. "Wait," I called out, my voice sounding strange and distant in the empty hallway. But as I reached the elevator, the doors slid shut with a soft ding. When they reopened seconds later, the gurney was gone. Shaken, I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. This was no trick of light, no hallucination born from fatigue. I had seen him, John Doe, the patient who didn't exist, the name on all those phantom charts. That night marked a turning point. The occurrences, already unsettling, intensified dramatically. Lights in room 302 would turn on and off by themselves. The phantom beep of heart monitors became a constant, eerie backdrop. And the charts, they now appeared everywhere. On patients' beds, in the break room, even in my locker. Each time, the same name. The same room number. And now, a message that made my blood run cold. Find the truth. The next day, instead of going home, I found myself in the hospital's dusty archive room. If answers existed, surely they'd be hidden in the yellowed pages of old records. Hours passed as I pored over admission logs, death certificates, and staff records. My eyes burned, and my back ached, but I couldn't stop. Something drove me forward, a mix of fear and an insatiable need to understand. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the small basement window, I found it. A file, buried deep in a box of records from over a decade ago. John Doe, real name John Matthews, admitted to room 302 with severe abdominal pain. My hands trembled as I read the file. John had died during a routine procedure, cause of death listed as complications. But something felt off. Notes were missing, dates didn't align, and the attending physician's signature was smudged, almost unreadable. I dug deeper, cross-referencing names and dates. A pattern began to emerge, one of inconsistencies and convenient omissions. John's death hadn't been from simple complications. It bore all the hallmarks of a covered-up medical mistake. As this realization dawned on me, the temperature in the room plummeted. The harsh fluorescent light flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, to find myself alone. But on the table where there had been nothing moments before, lay a single patient chart. With shaking hands, I opened it. Inside was a detailed account of what really happened that night, written in a handwriting I didn't recognize. The final line read, "They tried to erase me. Don't let them." I left the archive room that night with my world turned upside down. Everything I thought I knew about Central Hospital, about the practice of medicine, even about life and death itself, had been challenged. But one thing was clear. John Doe wasn't a ghost story or a hallucination. He was a victim, and he was asking for help. As I walked to my car, the weight of this knowledge heavy on my shoulders, I knew there was no turning back. Whatever the cost, I had to uncover the truth. For John, for myself, and for every patient who had ever put their trust in us. The following weeks became a blur of sleepless nights and clandestine investigations. I dug deeper into the hospital's past, piecing together a disturbing puzzle. John's case, it turned out, wasn't isolated. There were others, patients who had died under questionable circumstances, their records altered or conveniently misplaced. I started reaching out to former staff members, arranging discreet meetings in coffee shops and park benches. Many were reluctant to talk, fear etched in the lines of their faces. But a few opened up, sharing fragments of a larger, more sinister picture. Margaret, a retired nurse, trembled as she recounted her experiences. "There was a group of them," she whispered, glancing nervously around the quiet cafe. "Doctors who thought they were above it all. When mistakes were made, they made them disappear." As the truth began to take shape, the supernatural occurrences intensified. I'd wake up to find my research rearranged, key documents highlighted by an unseen hand. The temperature would drop dramatically whenever I got close to a crucial piece of information. It was as if John was guiding me, urging me forward. One night, as I was leaving the hospital after another late shift, I saw a figure standing in the window of room 302. It was John, his pale face illuminated by an otherworldly glow. Our eyes met, and in that moment, I felt a surge of emotions that weren't my own: anger, sorrow, and a desperate plea for justice. The next day, I made a breakthrough. Hidden in the back of an old filing cabinet, I found a logbook that had escaped the cover-up. It detailed a series of experimental procedures, unauthorized and dangerous. John's name was on that list, along with dozens of others. As I read, the implications horrified me. These weren't just isolated incidents of negligence. This was systematic abuse of power, a callous disregard for human life in the pursuit of medical advancement and personal glory. It all came to a head on a stormy night in late November. I was alone in the hospital, working late to compile my findings. As the clock struck midnight, the lights began to flicker, and a cold wind swept through the corridors. I found myself drawn to room 302, my feet moving of their own accord. As I pushed open the door, I gasped. The room had transformed. Gone was the empty, dusty space I'd known. Instead, I saw a fully equipped hospital room, as it might have looked a decade ago. And there, on the bed, lay John. But this time, he wasn't the spectral figure I'd glimpsed before. He looked solid, real, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "You've come," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the room. I nodded, unable to speak. John sat up, pointing to the corner of the room. There, shimmering into existence, was a filing cabinet I'd never seen before. "The proof you need," he said. "All of it. Names, dates, procedures." They thought they could bury the truth, but some things refused to stay hidden. As I approached the cabinet, a sense of finality settled over me. I knew that whatever I found inside would change everything. The hospital, my career, my understanding of the world. Nothing would ever be the same. With a deep breath, I reached for the handle, feeling the weight of John's gaze on my back. It was time to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The next morning, I marched into the hospital administrator's office, my arms laden with files and my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. Harriman, a man I'd respected for years, looked up from his desk, his face a mask of confusion that quickly morphed into concern. "Sarah, what's all this about?" he asked, gesturing to the stack of documents I'd unceremoniously dropped on his desk. "This," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "is the truth about John Doe and others like him." For the next hour, I laid out the evidence. The unauthorized procedures, the covered-up deaths, the altered records. With each revelation, Dr. Harriman's face grew paler. By the time I finished, he looked like he'd aged a decade. "My God," he whispered, slumping in his chair. "I had no idea. How long has this been going on?" The next few days were a whirlwind. An internal investigation was launched, followed swiftly by a more extensive probe from state medical authorities. The hospital became a hotbed of activity, with investigators combing through records and interviewing staff. Names were named, careers were ended, and the full extent of the scandal began to come to light. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents. It was a systemic problem that had persisted for years, protected by a culture of silence and intimidation. As the story broke in the media, I found myself at the center of a storm. There were interviews, depositions, and endless questions. Some hailed me as a whistleblower and a hero. Others, particularly those implicated in the scandal, branded me a traitor. Through it all, I held on to one truth. This wasn't about me. It was about John and all the others who had suffered in silence. It was about restoring integrity to a profession I loved and believed in. In the quiet hours of a crisp December morning, I found myself standing outside room 302. The door was open, the room now just another empty space awaiting new patients. But as I stood there, I felt a presence, calm, peaceful, and somehow grateful. "Thank you," a voice whispered, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. And then, like a weight lifting, the presence was gone. I knew, with a certainty that defied explanation, that John had finally found peace. The scandal changed everything. The hospital underwent a major overhaul, with new leadership and stringent oversight. Many left, unable to face the changes or their own complicity in past events. But some of us stayed, committed to rebuilding and ensuring nothing like this ever happened again. As for me, I found my perspective forever altered. I approached each patient chart with new eyes, seeing not just symptoms and treatments, but the sacred trust placed in our hands. The line between life and death, I had learned, was more permeable than I'd ever imagined. And sometimes, justice can come from the most unexpected places. Every now and then, I catch a glimpse of movement in room 302, or feel a sudden chill in the corridor. And I smile, knowing that in some way, John is still there, a silent guardian ensuring that the truth remains in the light. The whispers about the old service elevator had been circulating for years. "It's haunted," the orderlies would say. "It takes you to floors that don't exist," others claimed. I'd roll my eyes at these stories, attributing them to overactive imaginations and the eerie atmosphere of a hospital at night. The elevator in question was at the far end of the east wing, rarely used except by maintenance staff. It was an old thing, with a brass gate that closed manually and buttons that stuck when pressed. Most staff avoided it, preferring the modern elevators in the main lobby. "Did you hear about Jerry from radiology?" my colleague, Sarah, asked one night over coffee. "He swears the elevator took him to a floor with all zeros on the display. Says he heard music playing." I sipped my coffee, hiding a smirk. "Probably had a few drinks before his shift," I replied. "You know how he is." But as the weeks passed, more stories emerged. Nighttime security guards reported hearing faint music coming from the elevator shaft. A young intern claimed the elevator had taken her to a floor that looked like the hospital from 50 years ago. I prided myself on my skepticism, always seeking logical explanations. Yet, I couldn't deny the growing unease I felt each time I passed that old elevator. Little did I know, my rationality was about to be put to the ultimate test. It was a particularly hectic night in late October when it happened. A multi-car pileup had the ER bustling, and I'd been running between floors, assisting where needed. By 2 a.m., exhaustion was setting in, and I decided to take a shortcut back to my station in the ICU. The east wing was deserted, the silence broken only by the hum of fluorescent lights. As I approached the old elevator, a chill ran down my spine. The brass gate was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. Shaking off my unease, I stepped inside, pulling the gate closed behind me. The elevator creaked to life as I pressed the button for the 4th floor. That's when I first heard it, a faint melody, barely audible over the grinding of old gears. I cocked my head, straining to listen. It sounded like a lullaby, but distorted, as if played on an old phonograph. The floor indicator above the door began to move, but instead of ascending, it started to descend. My heart raced as I jabbed at the emergency stop button. Nothing happened. The numbers continued to tick down. 1, A, B, and then, impossibly, -1. Panic set in as the elevator continued its descent. The music grew louder, filling the small space with its eerie tune. I pounded on the doors, shouting for help, but my voice seemed swallowed by the melody. The floor indicator continued its impossible journey. -2, -3, -4. With each number, the temperature dropped, until I could see my breath misting in front of me. The lullaby reached a crescendo, the once sweet notes now discordant and chilling. At -13, the elevator shuddered to a stop. For a moment, all was silent. Then, with a groan, the brass gate began to slide open. What I saw beyond those doors defied all logic and reason. A long corridor stretched before me, but it wasn't the sterile hallway of a modern hospital. The walls were covered in peeling, yellowed wallpaper, and gas lamps flickered, casting long shadows. But it was the figures lining the corridor that turned my blood to ice. Patients in old-fashioned hospital gowns stood motionless, their pale faces turned towards me. With a jolt of horror, I recognized some of them, patients I had seen die over the years. As one, they began to reach out, beckoning me to join them. The music swelled, and I felt an inexplicable urge to step out of the elevator, to walk towards those waiting arms. In that moment, teetering on the brink of an impossible decision, I realized that everything I thought I knew about life, death, and the nature of reality was about to change forever. As I stood frozen in the elevator doorway, the scene before me defied all reason. The corridor stretched endlessly, bathed in a sickly greenish light that seemed to pulsate in rhythm with the haunting melody. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and decay, a nauseating combination that made my head spin. The patients, no, the spirits, began to move towards me with an unnatural grace. Their feet didn't touch the ground. They glided, leaving trails of mist in their wake. I recognized Mr. Johnson, who had died of heart failure just last month, his chest still bearing the marks of our failed resuscitation attempts. Behind him, little Sarah, a leukemia patient who had passed away at only 8 years old, her bald head now crowned with ethereal, wispy hair. "Join us," they whispered in unison, their voices a chorus of echoes that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Stay with us. You belong here." I gripped the elevator's brass gate, my knuckles turning white. Part of me was terrified, screaming to slam the gate shut and flee. But another part, a part one didn't recognize, felt an inexplicable pull towards them. The melody swelled, wrapping around me like a comforting blanket, urging me to step forward. As I wavered, my foot inching towards the threshold, I saw movement at the far end of the corridor. A dark figure, taller and more substantial than the misty patients, was making its way towards me. Unlike the others, this entity radiated malevolence. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that if this figure reached me, there would be no going back. The spirits nearest to me reached out, their cold fingers brushing my arms. The touch sent jolts of ice through my veins, and with them, flashes of memory. Not mine, but theirs. I saw glimpses of their lives, their deaths, and the endless waiting that followed. "Please," Sarah's spirit pleaded, her eyes wide and sorrowful. "We're so lonely here." The dark figure was getting closer, its form resolving into a towering silhouette cloaked in shadows. The melody reached a fever pitch, discordant notes screeching in my ears. In that moment of sheer terror and impossible choice, my survival instinct finally kicked in. With a desperate lunge, I threw myself backwards into the elevator, my hands scrambling for the control panel. My fingers found the emergency button, and I slammed it with all my might. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. The spirits pressed closer, their hands reaching through the slowly closing gate. The dark figure was now only yards away, its presence filling the corridor with an oppressive darkness. Then, with a violent jerk, the elevator began to ascend. The gate slammed shut, cutting off the grasping hands of the spirits. Their wails of disappointment mingled with the screech of protesting metal as the elevator rocketed upwards. The floor indicator spun wildly. -10, -5, -1, G, 3, 7. I huddled in the corner, my eyes squeezed shut, praying for it to end. With a final, bone-jarring thud, the elevator stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Cautiously, I opened my eyes. The indicator showed for my original destination. With shaking hands, I pulled open the gate and stumbled out into the familiar, brightly lit corridor of the ICU. "Nurse Anderson, are you all right?" "Yeah." Patel, the night attending, rushed towards me. "We've been looking everywhere for you. You've been missing for hours." I stared at him blankly, then at the clock on the wall. It was 6 a.m. 4 hours had passed since I'd entered that elevator. As dear. Patel led me to a chair, peppering me with questions. I caught my reflection in a window. My hair had turned stark white at the temples, and my eyes held a haunted look that I knew would never fully fade. "I'm fine," I mumbled, knowing it was a lie. "Just got stuck in the elevator for a bit." But even as I spoke those words, I could hear it, faint but unmistakable. The melody was still playing, calling me back. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried desperately to return to my normal routine. But the experience in the elevator had left an indelible mark on my psyche. Sleep became elusive, plagued by nightmares of endless corridors and reaching spectral hands. During my waking hours, I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at shadows and avoiding reflective surfaces for fear of what I might see. The worst part was the music. That haunting melody followed me everywhere. I heard it in the hum of fluorescent lights, in the beeping of medical equipment, even in the white noise of my apartment's air conditioning. It was always there, a faint, insidious reminder of what I'd experienced. My colleagues noticed the change in me. The bags under my eyes, the constant tension in my shoulders, the way I'd freeze momentarily every time I passed an elevator. They attributed it to stress, suggesting I take some time off. If only they knew the truth. I became obsessed with researching the hospital's history, spending my free time digging through old records and newspaper archives. I discovered that St. Augustine's had been built on the site of an old sanatorium, one with a dark history of experimental treatments and high mortality rates. The more I uncovered, the more I became convinced that what I'd experienced wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger, more terrifying truth. One night, about a month after the incident, I found myself standing in front of the old service elevator again. My heart raced as I reached out to touch the brass gate. The metal was ice-cold beneath my fingers, and for a moment, I swore I could hear the faint strains of that familiar melody coming from behind the closed doors. I jerked my hand back, stumbling away from the elevator. As I rushed down the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was calling me back. I realized then that I was standing at a crossroads. I could either continue down this path of obsession and fear, or I could find a way to confront what had happened and move forward. Little did I know, the decision would soon be made for me. As the months wore on, my fixation on the elevator incident only grew stronger. I found myself volunteering for extra night shifts, hoping to catch another glimpse of the paranormal. Every creak of the old hospital, every flickering light, sent a thrill of anticipation through me. I was both terrified and exhilarated by the possibility of another encounter. My investigation into the hospital's history yielded disturbing results. I uncovered records of patients who had gone missing over the years, last seen near the East Wing. Maintenance logs showed repeated malfunctions of the old elevator, often accompanied by reports of strange noises. The temptation to return to the elevator, to seek answers to the questions that haunted me, became almost unbearable. Several times, I found myself standing before those brass doors in the dead of night, my hand hovering over the call button. Each time, a mixture of fear and common sense held me back. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One stormy night, as I was making my rounds, the power in the hospital flickered. In that moment of darkness, I heard it clearly, the melody louder than ever before, coming from the direction of the old elevator. Without thinking, I found myself moving towards the sound, drawn like a moth to a flame. As I rounded the corner, I saw the elevator doors standing open, a soft, otherworldly light spilling out into the hallway. I stood at the threshold, my heart pounding. The choice before me was clear: step inside and face the unknown, or turn back and live with the questions forever. With a deep breath, I made my decision. It's been 3 years since I left St. Mary's Hospital, but the memories of those nights still haunt me. Before the incidents, I was just another night shift nurse, dedicated to my job and proud of my 10 years of experience in critical care. I thought I'd seen it all: life, death, and everything in between. But nothing in my training could have prepared me for what I encountered in room 313. The night everything changed was unusually cold for October. Mary stood like a sentinel against the dark sky, its Gothic architecture a stark reminder of its century-old history. As I made my way through the quiet corridors for my nightly rounds, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. Room 313 had always been different. Older nurses spoke of it in hushed tones, and even the most hardened doctors seemed to hurry past its closed door. I'd always dismissed their superstitions as silly folklore. That night, I wish I'd listened. As I entered the room, the chill in the air intensified. John Doe, our newest coma patient, lay motionless on the bed. His chart showed no change since his admission a week ago, another unnamed victim of a car crash, lost in the limbo between life and death. I approached to check his vitals. The steady beep of the heart monitor the only sound in the room. That's when I saw it. His eyes were open, staring unblinkingly at the ceiling. I leaned closer, checking for any sign of consciousness. "Sir, can you hear me?" I asked, more out of reflex than expectation. The monitor's beeping remained steady. No change in vitals. No movement. But then, so faint I almost missed it, a whisper. "They're coming." I jumped back, my heart racing. John Doe's eyes were now closed, his face as impassive as ever. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was my mind playing tricks after too many night shifts? As I hurried out of the room, I could have sworn I heard the whisper again, this time seeming to come from the very walls themselves. "They're coming." In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But strange occurrences began to pile up, each one chipping away at my rational explanations. Equipment would malfunction inexplicably, but only in certain rooms. Patients reported seeing shadows moving in the corners of their vision. The night staff began to talk about cold spots in the hallways, areas where the temperature would drop suddenly and inexplicably. At first, my colleagues brushed off my concerns about room 313. "You're letting those old ghost stories get to you, Sarah," they'd say with a laugh. But their amusement faded as the incidents escalated. One night, I found Lisa, a young nurse barely out of training, sobbing in the break room. "I saw something," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "In room 313, a figure standing over the patient. But when I blinked, it was gone." I tried to comfort her, but my own unease was growing. I began to notice patterns in the strange events. They always seemed to intensify around 3:13 a.m. Patients in rooms near 313 reported more frequent nightmares. And the coma patients, they were starting to show unusual brain activity during the night hours. As I pored over patient charts and incident reports, trying to make sense of it all, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The hospital held secrets, and somehow the patient in room 313 was the key to unlocking them. Little did I know, my search for answers was about to lead me down a path that would challenge everything I believed about life, death, and the shadowy realm that lies between. As the strange occurrences multiplied, I knew I couldn't ignore them any longer. I began digging into St. Mary's history, spending my breaks in the hospital's dusty archives and questioning the older staff members. Mr. Jenkins, the night janitor who'd worked at St. Mary's for over 4 decades, was the first to give me a solid lead. "You know, nurse," he said one night, his voice low and conspiratorial, "this place wasn't always a hospital. Rumor has it, it was built on an old cemetery." That revelation sent me deeper into my investigation. I scoured old newspapers and city records, piecing together the hospital's dark past. Mary's, it turned out, was constructed in 1902 on land that had indeed been a 19th century cemetery. The bodies were supposed to have been relocated, but historical accounts suggested the job was rushed and incomplete. As I shared my findings with a few trusted colleagues, I noticed a shift in how they looked at me. Some became distant, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. Others, like Dr. Martinez, the empathetic head of neurology, listened with growing concern. "Sarah," he said after one of our discussions, "be careful with this. Some things are better left buried." His warning only fueled my determination. I couldn't shake the feeling that understanding the hospital's history was somehow crucial to explaining the current events. But with each new piece of information I uncovered, I felt increasingly isolated. My colleagues started to avoid me, whispering behind my back. I overheard phrases like "overworked" and "needs a vacation," but I knew what I had experienced was real. And as I delved deeper into St. Mary's secrets, I was about to discover just how real and how terrifying the truth could be. My investigation seemed to trigger an intensification of the paranormal activity. It was as if the hospital itself was reacting to my probing into its past. The incidents became more frequent and more difficult to dismiss. One night, as I was checking on a patient in the ICU, all the equipment in the room suddenly flatlined. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought the patient had died, but he was breathing normally, peacefully asleep. As quickly as it had happened, the machines sprang back to life, showing normal readings. When I checked the logs later, there was no record of any malfunction. The coma patients, especially those near room 313, began showing increasing signs of awareness, but only during the night shift. EEG readings would spike at precisely 3:13 a.m., showing brain activity consistent with REM sleep or even consciousness. Yet, when examined, the patients remained unresponsive. Then came the whispers. At first, it was just the patient in 313. But soon, other coma patients began to murmur in their sleep. Always at night, always with the same chilling messages. They're restless. The ground is angry. They want to return. I started keeping a detailed log of every incident, every whisper, every unexplained event. As the evidence mounted, I found myself torn between my medical training and what I was experiencing. How could I reconcile the rational, scientific world I'd always known with these inexplicable occurrences? The breaking point came on a particularly busy night. As I rushed to respond to a code blue, I saw a dark figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to be composed more of shadow than substance. I blinked, and it was gone. But as I hurried past where it had stood, I felt an icy cold that penetrated to my bones. That night, after my shift, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot, hands shaking as I reviewed my notes. The weight of everything I'd seen and heard pressed down on me. I knew then that I was past the point of no return. Whatever was happening at St. Mary's, whatever dark forces were at play, I was now irrevocably involved. With a deep breath, I made a decision. It was time to uncover the full truth about St. Mary's, no matter the cost. My relentless pursuit of the truth led me to the city's historical society. There, in a forgotten file tucked away in a dusty corner, I found what I had been searching for: the original plans for St. Mary's Hospital. As I unfolded the yellowed blueprints, my heart nearly stopped. The hospital wasn't just built on a cemetery, it was built into it. The lowest level of St. Mary's, now used for storage and old records, aligned perfectly with the layout of the old cemetery. Room 313, I realized with a chill, was directly above what used to be the cemetery's central morgue. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the hospital, determined to investigate the basement. As I descended the stairs, the air grew thick and oppressive. The dim fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting long shadows that seemed to reach out towards me. In a far corner, behind stacks of old files and broken equipment, I found a door that didn't appear on any modern hospital plans. It was old, made of heavy wood with rusted iron fittings. With trembling hands, I pushed it open. The room beyond was small and circular, its walls lined with strange symbols etched into the stone. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it lay a book bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. As I approached the pedestal, the whispers I'd been hearing for weeks grew louder, surrounding me. I opened the book, and a gust of cold air rushed past me, extinguishing the lights. In the darkness, I saw them, translucent figures emerging from the walls, their eyes fixed on me with a hungry intensity. I ran, slamming the door behind me, but I knew it was too late. Whatever barrier had existed between our world and theirs, I had just broken it. The next night shift was when everything came to a head. As soon as I stepped into the hospital, I could feel the difference. The air was charged, like the calm before a storm. Shadows seemed deeper, more alive, and the usual hospital sounds were muffled, as if the building itself was holding its breath. It started in room 313. The patient's heart monitor began to wail, its frantic beeping echoing down the hallway. When I rushed in, I found him convulsing, his eyes wide open and completely black. As I called for help, his voice, impossibly strong for someone who had been in a coma, filled the room. "They're here." Chaos erupted throughout the hospital. Every piece of electronic equipment went haywire. Lights flickered and died, plunging entire wings into darkness. And in that darkness, things moved. Shadowy figures darted through hallways, their whispers growing to a deafening cacophony. Patients began screaming, some claiming they could see deceased loved ones at the foot of their beds. Others spoke in languages they shouldn't know, their voices not their own. The coma patients, almost in unison, sat up in their beds, their eyes vacant but their mouths moving in silent screams. In the midst of this nightmare, I found myself running towards the basement, drawn by an inexplicable force. As I reached the hidden room, I saw the book on the pedestal glowing with an eerie light. The symbols on the walls pulsed, and the air shimmered with spectral forms. I realized then that this was the epicenter. Whatever was happening, it was pouring through from this point, using the hospital, built on the threshold between life and death, as a gateway. With a clarity born of desperation, I knew what I had to do. The barrier had to be restored, the gateway closed. But as I stepped towards the pedestal, 100 ghostly hands reached out to stop me, and I heard a voice, ancient and terrible, whisper, "Join us or face us." In that moment of terror and desperation, I made a choice that would change my life forever. I spoke to the spirits, offering myself as a mediator between their world and ours. In exchange for peace, I would ensure the hospital acknowledged its history and honored the dead. The chaos subsided, but at a great personal cost. The spirits retreated, but a part of them remained with me. I can still hear their whispers, see glimpses of the other side. The hospital administration, shaken by the night's events, agreed to my proposals. I left St. Mary soon after, but I know my connection to that place, and to the world beyond, will never truly end. It's been 3 years since that fateful night at St. Mary's. The hospital has changed. A memorial garden now stands where the old cemetery was, and room 313 has been converted into a quiet space for reflection. The paranormal activities have ceased, but the air there still feels different. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.